Have you ever imagined waking up one day and discovering that scientists have actually done things that seem like something out of a horror movie? Well, the history of science is full of bizarre, unbelievable, and disturbing experiments that really happened. And the worst part is that many of these studies went beyond the limits of ethics and morals. What if I told you that they once tried to keep a dog's head alive without a body? Or that a simple psychological experiment turned ordinary? College students into real sadists. Science has always sought answers, but sometimes the questions go too far. In today's video, you will learn about 5 scientific experiments that are so shocking that they seem like fiction, but are completely real. Prepare to doubt humanity, be impressed by the creativity or madness of scientists, and understand how these tests shape the world we live in. But be careful, after hearing these stories, you will never see science the same way again. Imagine a dingy laboratory in the 1920s, where science was still venturing into uncharted territory with few clear rules of ethics. Now, imagine a cold metal table in the center of the room. On it, something that looks like something out of a horror movie, a dog's head severed from its body. And alive! Sounds impossible, right? But not for Sergei Brukhonenko, a Soviet scientist who, obsessed with understanding the mysteries of blood circulation and life after clinical death, created a bizarre machine called the autojector. This device, basically a rudimentary heart-lung pump, was capable of keeping organs and even a head functioning without the rest of the body. This actually happened, and the world didn't know whether to applaud the scientific breakthrough or run away in fear. Brukhonenko began testing his invention on dogs, and the accounts of the experiments are so unbelievable that they seem like fiction. The autojector acted as the animal's heart and lungs, pumping oxygenated blood directly into the head of the decapitated dog. And here comes the shocking part. The dog still reacted. The scientist gently tapped on the table and its head tried to turn in the direction of the sound. They even passed food in front of its nose and it licked its nose as if it were still hungry. If you're feeling a shiver down your spine right now, just imagine the scientists who witnessed this for the first time. Some reports say they even tried poking the dog's eyes, and believe it or not, it blinked in response. At another point, they put citric acid on its tongue and it grimaced. There's no denying it. It was one of the most bizarre experiments in the history of science. Now you might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Well, Brukhonenko wasn't just some crazy scientist trying to shock the world. He was actually determined to advance medicine. And in a way, he succeeded. His work helped develop modern heart-lung machines, the kind used in surgery to keep patients alive while their vital organs are temporarily shut down. But despite the supposed advances, the experiment was widely criticized. Many saw it as a monstrosity worthy of Dr. Frankenstein. Years later, when the USSR released footage of the experiment, the reaction was a mix of horror and fascination. Some doubted the veracity of the video, but most historians and scientists agree that yes, it really did happen. Today, the autojector is remembered as one of the most macabre experiments in medical history. And while no one wants to see living dog heads on a table again, there's no denying that this insane experiment helped save lives in the future. Now imagine this. You're walking through a park and suddenly you see a family sitting on a bench, a happy couple, a cute baby playing, and a chimpanzee, also in a diaper, sitting next to them, like another child. This isn't a scene from a comedy movie, but a real scientific experiment. In the 1930s, a psychologist named Winthrop Kellogg had an idea that at the time seemed revolutionary, or completely crazy, depending on your point of view. He and his wife decided to raise their newborn son Donald side by side with a baby chimpanzee named Gua. The goal: to find out if a human could learn to behave like a monkey, or if a monkey could learn to behave like a human. If that idea already sounds strange to you, wait until you hear the details. Kellogg wasn't kidding. He raised Donald and Gua exactly the same way. Like two brothers, the two slept in the same crib, ate together, played together, and received the same stimulation. The logic was simple. If human babies learn to speak and act by watching their parents, then perhaps a chimpanzee growing up in the same environment could also learn human skills. At first, everything seemed to be going as expected. Guo was smart, learned quickly, and even responded to basic commands better than Donald. She could understand orders, recognize objects, and even demonstrated empathy. But then came the shock. Little by little, Donald began to behave more like a chimpanzee than a human baby. That's right! Instead of Guo starting to speak, it was Donald who began to imitate the chimpanzee's gestures and sounds. He walked more hunched over, made guttural sounds, and even tried to communicate by clapping his hands and using exaggerated facial expressions, just like his adopted sister. What was supposed to be an experiment about monkeys learning to be human turned into a baby learning to be a monkey. When they realized that Donald was barking, grunting, and having more ease expressing himself like a chimpanzee than like a normal child, the parents panicked. They realized that Guo's influence on the baby was much stronger than their influence on Guo. The situation became so strange that after a few months, the Kellogg's had to end the experiment. And here comes the question. What did this experiment teach? Well, besides showing that babies are sponges and absorb any behavior around them, it also made it clear that no matter how intelligent an animal is, there are biological barriers that are difficult to overcome. Guo was smart, but her brain was not prepared to learn language like a human. Donald, on the other hand, proved that intense coexistence with another species can influence much more than we imagine. The study was interrupted, and Donald went back to being raised in a normal way. But the case went down in the history of psychology as one of the strangest experiments ever done. After all, it's not every day that a human baby has to unlearn how to be a monkey. What about you? Would you raise your child with a chimpanzee just to see what happens? The Kellogg's tried and regretted it. Imagine that you go to the hospital to treat a common illness, something like an infection or even a simple routine checkup. Now, imagine that. Without your knowledge, doctors are injecting plutonium into your body as if you were a lab rat. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But it really happened. During the Cold War, the United States was obsessed with the nuclear arms race. The world was in a climate of paranoia, where any scientific advance could be the difference between victory and total annihilation. And in the name of science, or rather, in the name of war, some people became human guinea pigs without even knowing it. Between 1945 and 1947, a group of scientists linked to the US government carried out sinister experiments with radiation. The goal: to understand the effect of highly radioactive substances on the human body. To do this, they selected 18 patients, including men, women, the elderly, and even children, and injected them with small doses of plutonium, a highly toxic and lethal chemical element. The most terrifying detail? None of these people knew they were being poisoned. The patients had come to the hospital for common ailments like muscle aches or arthritis, but without any warning or consent, they became living guinea pigs in a deadly experiment. Doctors coldly recorded the effects: organ failure, hair loss, excruciating pain, and in many cases a slow, agonizing death. Among the most famous victims was a man named Eb Cade, a construction worker who was hospitalized in a car accident. He was supposed to receive treatment for broken bones, but instead he became the first human guinea pig for plutonium in the United States. Unbeknownst to him, doctors injected him with an absurd dose of the radioactive element and watched what would happen. Days later, scientists began taking pieces of his bones and teeth to analyze the damage caused by the plutonium as if he were a walking experiment. The most unbelievable part? Eb Cade survived for a few more years, but no one knows exactly what happened to him after he escaped from the hospital, suspecting that something very wrong was happening. The test continued in several hospitals across the US, always choosing poor or familyless patients as they were less likely to question or draw attention to themselves. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Years later, secret documents were leaked and exposed the horrors of the radioactive experiments. The revelation caused outrage, as it showed that the US government itself had treated citizens as disposable guinea pigs. In 1994, almost 50 years later, then President Bill Clinton publicly admitted the crimes and apologized on behalf of the government. But apologies don't erase the mistakes of the past, right? Today, this case is remembered as one of the darkest and most unethical episodes in the history of science, proving that in times of war, the line between scientific advancement and atrocity can be dangerously thin. One day you walk into a laboratory in the early 20th century. The room smells strongly of chemicals, and suddenly a scientist picks up a frog's heart, separates it from the animal's body, and places it on the table. You think, that's it, the heart is gonna stop. But no, it keeps beating. Now imagine your reaction to seeing this heart beating on its own, without being connected to anything, as if it were a possessed object. It sounds like a scene from a horror movie, but this was a real experience that changed the history of medicine forever. The idea came from scientists who wanted to understand how cardiac muscles work. The heart is a unique organ because unlike the other muscles in the body, it beats on its own without us needing to think about it. But if it were possible to keep it working outside the body, who knows? Maybe one day we could even stop a heart, repair it, and make it beat again. The first experiments began with frogs because their hearts are small, resistant, and easy to observe. The procedure seemed simple, but it was extremely macabre. They removed the frog's heart and, using a combination of electricity and chemicals, managed to keep it beating. Now imagine the scene. A loose heart on a bench beating as if it was still inside the animal's body. If that doesn't sound like something out of science fiction, I don't know what could. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Scientists discovered that even hours after being removed from the body, the heart could still be revived. If it was placed in a solution rich in ions such as potassium and calcium, which helped maintain muscle contractions. What's more, if they applied small electric shocks, they could control the heartbeat, speeding it up or slowing it down. This is how one of the principles of modern cardiology was born. These tests paved the way for major advances such as the creation of pacemakers, devices that help regulate the heartbeats of patients with heart problems. In addition, these experiments helped develop techniques that are now essential for heart transplants and heart surgeries. Of course, at the time, many people were horrified by the idea of a beating heart without a body. It was as if science was defying the laws of life. Some newspapers even called the scientists Frankenstein's apprentices, and the sight of a beating heart outside of the body seemed more like witchcraft than medicine. But despite its terrifying appearance, the experiment proved that the heart doesn't need a brain to function. It has its own electrical system. It was a crucial step toward understanding how to keep a patient alive, even in extreme situations such as surgery or cardiac arrest. You are at a university, just another normal student, full of tests, assignments, and that irresistible urge to skip classes. Now, imagine that suddenly you receive an interesting proposal. Participate in a psychological experiment for 2 weeks and earn good money for it. Sounds easy, right? That was exactly the proposal that psychologist Philip Zimbardo made to a group of students at Stanford University in 1971. But what seemed like a simple study on human behavior quickly turned into a terrifying nightmare. Zimbardo wanted to understand how power and authority can change people's behavior. To do this, he set up a fake prison in the basement of the psychology department and divided the volunteers into 2 groups. Half would be guards, and the other half would be prisoners. Up until that point, everything seemed like a simple role-playing game. But within a few days, the experiment got completely out of control. On the first day, everything went smoothly. The students chosen to be prisoners wore simple uniforms and were given numbers instead of names. The guards, on the other hand, were given mirrored sunglasses, batons, and uniforms that made them look more threatening. The idea was simply to observe how each group would behave. Within 48 hours, the guards began to display sadistic and authoritarian behavior. They forced the prisoners to do push-ups until exhaustion, yelled at them, and even invented humiliating punishments. And with each passing day, things got more bizarre. The prisoners were forced to sleep on the floor, to clean toilets with their bare hands, and even to strip naked as a form of punishment. The guards began to treat the prisoners not as fellow university students, but as real criminals. And the worst part? Zimbardo did nothing to stop it. In fact, the psychologist himself began to get too involved in the experiment, assuming the role of prison warden and allowing the abuse to continue, all in the name of science. The climax of the experiment came when one of the prisoners, a student named Douglas Corpy, suffered a psychological breakdown. He began to scream, cry, and became completely desperate. He kept saying that he wanted to get out, that he couldn't take it anymore, that it was affecting his mind. And what did the guards do? They laughed at him. Zimbardo, seeing all this, was still hesitant to stop the experiment. After all, he wanted to understand how far people could go when placed in positions of absolute power. But then something shocking happened. A graduate student, Christina Maslach, visited the prison and was horrified by what she saw. She confronted Zimbardo and told him that he had completely lost his sense of ethics. At that moment, Zimbardo realized that he had gone too far. The experiment, which was supposed to last 2 weeks, was stopped after just 6 days. When the prisoners were released and the guards took off their uniforms, everyone realized what had happened. Ordinary people, normal college students who had been transformed into aggressors and victims, all because they had been placed in an environment that encouraged brutality. The Stanford prison study became one of the most infamous experiments in psychology, proving that power can corrupt anyone, and that in certain situations people can commit terrible acts without even realizing it. We've reached the end of this video about 5 of the most bizarre, shocking, and unbelievable scientific experiments in history. Each of them showed us something frightening about human nature, the limits of science, and how far some brilliant minds are willing to go in the name of knowledge. From a frog's heart beating on his own on a bench to a group of college students turning into real monsters, these cases prove that reality can often be more disturbing than fiction. But now, we want to know your opinion. To what extent should science go to discover new things? Is anything worth it in the name of progress? Or are there limits that should never be crossed? Leave your comment and tell us, which of these experiments did you find the most bizarre? Or have you ever experienced something strange that would make a great experiment? See you in the next video, folks.